Wow, what a crowd. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for your interest in thinking about a career in psychology down the line for you all. I was a high school student many years ago, and I wasn't at all interested in psychology and didn't find it until I got to University of Winnipeg. I was heading right straight for pre-med, as my family tends to do, and I got sidetracked, and very happily so. I have never regretted going into psychology. Like Kaylin, though I've been a psychologist for some time now, I am also trained as a clinical psychologist. I did my training University of Winnipeg undergrad. I went to University of Saskatchewan for my master's, and I went to Concordia for my PhD. So I've been in a number of different institutions across the land and lived in a number of different provinces while getting my training. So we have a big job to do to talk about psychology, and your interest in the number of people in this room speaks to how popular the field of psychology is. Psychology is huge. It has a whole bunch of different things. So the greatest thing I think about psychology is that you can never really be bored because there's always something of interest in the field of psychology for pretty much everybody. There are a whole bunch of different kinds of psychologists. We represent clinical psychologists, and I guess basically you can break them down into the researcher psychologists or the academic psychologist researchers or the applied psychologists. And in the applied world of psychology, so the application of psychological research and knowledge in daily life, there are clinical psychologists, which we both are, and there are a lot of clinical psychologists. And when people think about psychologists, they often think about clinical psychologists, the ones who do psychological assessment, psychotherapy, consultation. So we're often the ones that they think about, or school psychology. Many of you would have had access during your time in school to school psychologists. So those are both applied psychology. There's also industrial organizational applied psychology. There's a whole range of applied psychology, but there's also all the academic psychologists and the research. A big thing about psychology is the application of research to our practice. That's sort of what separates us from many other mental health practitioners and other health practitioners, is the emphasis on research and research informing our practice. So we're always interested in figuring out if what we're doing is working, and assessing how to do things better. Okay, so that's a big part of psychology. So I have sort of touched on, but just to go a little bit further in terms of where you can have a career in psychology, you can, as I said, work at a university or as a researcher in a research lab somewhere or with a research center. You can work in hospitals. Many clinical psychologists work in hospitals providing healthcare assistance. So people tend to think of psychologists as dealing with mental health issues only, and that is by far not true. Psychologists in Manitoba are very present in cancer care, cardiac care, in pain clinics. So psychologists are all throughout healthcare helping patients cope with the illnesses that they're faced with, as well as dealing with, and primarily, the anxiety and depression that often goes along with life's challenges, that we get anxious about them, or we get depressed or sad, or our moods get affected. And I know Kaylin's research is right in that area. And so anxiety and depression are really big areas of expertise for psychologists, as is behavior. Okay, so training to be a psychologist, and Kaylin will talk more about this because he's right in the middle of it. But I'll just tell you right off, because you're in high school, it takes a long time to become a psychologist. After high school, it's about 10 years, okay, of university training. Now, unlike high school, and sorry for the high school teachers here, you're not and maybe, I know in high school this is true too, but a lot of the work in the field of psychology is very practical, is very hands-on. So you're actually doing the research, you're actually working with the patients, you're actually working with the clients, learning how to be a psychologist. So it's very hands-on, very experience-based, very mentorship-driven, as well as being heavy on the books, okay? So just a little tip, if you don't like school, psychology is probably not the place for you, because it's going to take a lot of school to become a psychologist. So you have to like school, like learning, be curious. That's, I'd say, one of the hallmark features of a psychologist is we're very curious about what makes people tick, why do they do the things they do, how do we help them do things maybe in a way that's better for them or healthier for them or makes them happier. So those are the kinds of things that psychologists are very curious about, and we spend our careers looking at those things. Okay, so the other thing, we had a list of questions that we could look at in terms of preparing ourselves to speak to you, and one of them was, you know, what are the good things about your career? And I think I've spoken about a couple of them, but I would say that one of them is also you tend to be the driver of your own bus, okay, the pilot of your own plane, whatever metaphor you want to look at. You pretty much get to create the career you want. because you are fairly autonomous and in demand, okay? We've talked, or we will talk, and certainly Manitoba Psychological Society and the Canadian Psychological Association is very focused on trying to get better access for Canadians to psychology, because lots of people go see psychologists, but you have to have often, unfortunately, you have to have money to pay to go see a psychologist privately. There are lots of psychologists, I didn't mention that, who work in private practice. There are psychology services, as I mentioned, available to people through schools, through hospitals, but you have to be a patient in the hospital usually to get access, okay? Or you have to be a kid in the school to get access. Once you step out of those institutions, you no longer get access, and that's a problem for our profession and for, I think, Canadians at large, that we need to improve access to psychologists. And the demand is there because all private practitioners that I know have a long waiting list, okay? So the people want to see psychologists. It's just getting access to them is a tricky thing, and we need more of them. So any of you who are interested, we need more psychologists, okay? And it is a great autonomous, independent field to work in for the rest of your life. Okay, I mentioned that I am a clinical psychologist. And I'll just get to me now a little bit. I work in a very non-typical place for a psychologist, even though in my agency there are two predecessors, both the executive directors before me were both psychologists as well. It's not that typical to have psychologists in social services, but I am very happily there, and oftentimes in social services, the psychologists are the heads of the organizations. So McDonald Youth Services is headed by a psychologist, Knowles Center is headed by a psychologist, and my agency, New Directions, is also headed by a psychologist. So I don't work a lot directly with the participants or the service users of New Directions. I work with the staff, and I work with funders, and I work with government to try to get the services for the people. So I work at a more administrative level, which wasn't my intent when I trained. It's just that's how it's turned out. And it suits me quite well in terms of, again, I don't like to be bored. I really hate to be bored, and there's no way in my life I could ever be bored. There's always things to do. There's always things to do better. There's always people to talk to make things happen. So it's a very good career if you like change and if you like to be able to push things and drive things. It's a very good career for that. Okay, in order to get into graduate school, and I guess this is what I want to say, there's a lot of people in this room who have at least a beginning interest in psychology. There will be a lot of people at university who have an interest in psychology. Psychology is often the biggest undergraduate department at universities with the most students in them. Of those students, not that many will go on. Okay, and certainly into clinical psychology, if you have an interest in clinical, it's a very competitive field to get into. So you really have to like school, like really, and you need to get really good marks in order to get into clinical psychology. Experimental psychology, research psychology, a little less so. If you have the interest and you're a good enough student, like a good student, you can have a very good career in research without having to be a straight A student. Okay, so just to encourage you that if you are interested, don't muck about in undergraduate university, focus on those grades, okay? Alrighty, so I have sort of talked about, psychologists are very interested in what makes people do and think and feel the things they do, they think, and they feel. We are very curious about how why people behave the way they do, and how do we help them if they want help. Okay, it's not done to them, but if people are unhappy in their lives, how do we help them adjust or change the way they do things so that they have a happier life going forward. Okay, and also psychologists work with babies all the way to people who are on the edge of death. Okay, so there's no age range, there's no specific domain that people have to work in. I trained actually as an adolescent psychologist, so you guys. I love adolescence in terms of your stage of life. It's a time when you get to choose where you're going to go in your lives. And that's the first time. When you're little kids, your parents pretty much, and that's as it needs to be, your parents control pretty much the choices that lay before you. As you get to your age, you start to make choices. You get to start to drive your own life going forward. And so that's a very exciting time of life, and I welcome you to consider a choice about going into psychology into the future. I'll let Kaylin come up now and take over, and we'll then answer questions after the two of us, okay?
Wow, big crowd. This is great. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the training in psychology. So Jennifer talked a bit about the careers in psychology once you're kind of out of school, but I want to talk about the experience of actually being in school, what that's like to be trained, what that kind of looks like, how long it takes. So as Jennifer mentioned, schooling takes about 10 years after high school, so it's a long road, but it does change, it does evolve as you move through. So after you enter into university, you're going to be doing a degree, and that takes about 4 years, okay? And if you do get into grad school, as a clinical psychologist, and that's what I can speak to because that's what I'm in, that's my experience, things kind of shift. You do a lot of coursework, but that does shift into working more in the field. You do start working with clients, after your degree. And you also do your own research. So there's kind of 3 parts to that. So there's a lot of variety. And so your training isn't just kind of sitting in class and being lectured at. There is a lot of interaction with other people. There's a lot of generating ideas, generating new knowledge. So it's actually a really exciting experience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to address some of the questions that we were asked to answer pretty directly. So we're asked to describe the daily routines and responsibilities of your occupation. So what does a typical day look like on the job? So every day is different in training. Every day you're doing something totally different. So some days later on in your degree when you're at the PhD level, you might be working in a hospital with clients. You might be working out in the prison. You could be working with military personnel. And then in the same day, you could be going and doing your research and taking a couple classes. So there's a lot of variety in your day. So it's never, ever boring, just like Jennifer said. How much of your day is spent working with other people? A lot of your day is spent working with other people. You interact with your peers and colleagues, and you work with clients as well. At the same time, you do spend a lot of time on your own writing and reading. So there is a lot of kind of schooling that goes along with that and learning theory. So again, if schooling is not for you, the training is pretty tough as a psychologist because there's a lot of that. But at the same time, if that's your thing, if you do like learning and you like kind of taking in new ideas, it is an absolutely exhilarating kind of experience because there's no shortage of knowledge. In fact, they're estimating about 90% of what we know about the brain we've learned in the last 40 to 50 years. So this is a really young science. There's a lot to learn. It's very exciting to be a part of it. So if you're interested in science and you're interested in kind of human behavior and understanding what makes people tick, I think it's a pretty exciting career. Why did I choose this occupation? There's a lot of reasons. I'm kind of a generalist. I like learning about a lot of different things. I like biology, I like medicine, I like philosophy, and I like helping people, and I like being independent. So as a psychologist, a career in psychology really combines all those things. You get to learn about all kinds of different things, and you get to help people. You're very independently driven. Towards the end, once you've done your coursework, you're kind of left on your own. You're supervised, but you're left on your own to kind of decide what you want to do. So there's a lot of independence in that. So that's kind of why I got into it, and why I stayed in psychology. Why I'm continuing to learn what I learned is because, like I said, I think it's a young science. There's a lot of it combines a lot of different areas. I mean, if you get into psychology, it doesn't have to be clinical, right? Anything you do, any kind of career that you can think of, it overlaps with psychology in some way, right? So if you think about, if you're interested in technology, right, somewhere there's cognitive psychologists that are figuring out what the best interface is between humans and technological devices, for example, like your iPad, or they're figuring out what the best layout for a cockpit is on an airplane so that the pilots can interact with that in a meaningful way. So it doesn't matter what you do, psychology is involved in that. So there's a lot of different directions you can go in. What other opportunities for other positions or advancements are there in this occupation? Training in psychology is really, it gives you a really good foundation. If you actually did want to make a lateral move into another career, training in clinical psychology is very good for that. I mean, if you wanted to get into marketing, if you wanted to get into business, there's a lot of opportunities to do that. But at the same time, there's roughly 50 different disciplines within psychology. So there's a lot of different things you can do within psychology. And as Jennifer mentioned, there's a real demand for psychologists, especially clinical psychologists and the services that clinical psychologists offer. So there's a lot of opportunities once you get your training to do all kinds of different things. What qualities and skills do you possess that make you successful in your present position? I think having a good thirst for knowledge, like really enjoying learning, And being patient with the process, just understanding that your training is a part of kind of a process of becoming the person that you want to be, doing things that you enjoy, just understanding that your training is a part of that, and it's a process. I think taking that position is something that really helps. You have to be comfortable with yourself. So learning a lot about yourself and knowing a lot about yourself is important because this is a challenging field, but extremely rewarding, no question. Are you required to travel? As a graduate student, you can do all kinds of travel. There's lots of research conferences that you can go to. If you play your cards right, the university will pay for that, so you can actually get paid to travel. So that's exciting. How do you see this occupation changing in the next 5 years? Will the demand for workers increase or decrease? So I just wanted to echo what Jennifer said. The demand for psychologists is incredible. I think the research shows that people really do want psychological services. It's really unfortunate that it's not kind of covered at this point in time by the government, but there is a demand for psychologists, and so the field is definitely blossoming. So the last thing I want to address is, what advice do you have for young persons considering this occupation? Well, I'm hesitant to give advice per se, but I could plant the seed in terms of a few things that I would think about. Generally, I think after graduating from high school, it's good to, I think, take a step back and think about your interests. Think about whether, even working for a little bit or even traveling for a little bit, just to get some perspective on kind of what you want to do, I think is a good idea. And then getting into university after that, if that's what you want to do, I think is a good thing to do. But taking that step back and thinking about your interests are really important, because that's going to be, in the long haul, for your education, that's going to be really critical for making sure that you're getting into the right career, is kind of getting some life experience and making sure that you have that before you kind of make those decisions. And if you're confident that you do want to go to university right away, I think that's absolutely great. And psychology is an excellent discipline to get involved with. So I guess that's all the that's all the kind of experience that I can offer.